I regret it having been so long since I was with them. That's true. I feel as if I haven't seen most of you for a week now. But it is good to be together. Are we clear on what's going on in our epistle lesson? Onesimus, the slave, has run away from his owner in Turkey, Philemon. He has run away and is somehow connected with Paul, who is imprisoned but still engaged in his mission in Rome. And Philemon has become a Christian, and he has become one of Paul's best helpers in the gospel mission there. And so Paul has sent the runaway slave Philemon home to Colossus, to his master, to Philemon, with this letter, in which the letter asks Philemon to set Onesimus free and send him back voluntarily to help Paul with the mission. Now, so the context of this letter is slavery. The offensive context makes it hard for us to even read the letter, much less get something out of it. And we can be thankful that Paul is at least trying to set one slave free, and that helps. But he doesn't say what we want him to say. He doesn't say, Philemon, slavery is wrong, cut it out. He doesn't take that kind of stand. Now, Paul is a Jew. He is the descendant of slaves. He knows slavery is wrong. Paul is a Christian. He has already written to the Galatians, for freedom Christ has set us free. And in Christ, there is no slave nor master. So he knows slavery is wrong. But he doesn't say it. He says in passing, I could, as an apostle, order you, Philemon, to do the right thing, but I want to do something else instead. He says, I would rather appeal to you on the basis of love. I would rather appeal to you on the basis of love. And there's a lot of love going on in this letter. Paul expresses his love for Christ, his love for Philemon, and his love for Onesimus. And Paul expresses his confidence that Philemon loves Christ and Philemon loves Paul. And he's inviting Philemon to stretch his love a little bit further, far enough to include someone outside his normal circle of concern, the slave Onesimus. But love is costly, because love is action, not just feeling. And stretching this love is going to cost Philemon something. Now, it's also going to bless Philemon. It's also going to bless him more richly than he can imagine, with a wider, deeper, better life. But it's a cost. So what is the cost? Philemon has already given his house to serve as the church in Colossae. He has already contributed substantially to support Paul's missionary ventures around the known world. Now, Paul is asking him to contribute Onesimus. And to us, Onesimus is a person. But if we dare to put ourselves in Philemon's moral shoes, if we dare to look at the world through the first century moral lenses that Philemon wore, Onesimus was an asset. He was wealth. Onesimus was $12,000. It took a lot of gall to ask for that kind of gift. But Paul can ask it because he asks it out of love. Love for Onesimus, love for Christ, and yes, love for Philemon. Perhaps love for Philemon most of all. But how does that work? How does loving somebody justify or inspire you to put your hand in their pocket? A story that may explain. Methodist pastor J. Cliff Clifford took his wife fishing on their honeymoon. He loved to fish, and she loved to see him happy. So they went fishing. Pastor Cliff and his bride were in a boat on a lake in Arkansas. And as I say, he liked fishing, and he also wanted to show off for his wife what an expert fisherman he was. So Cliff tied a 3-hook lure to his line and cast it into the lake. And after a while, he hooked a huge bass that put up a terrific fight. But Cliff was determined to catch that bass. He was going to possess it, to dominate it, to own it, to show it off as a prize. This was a fight between him and that fish, and he was going to win. His whole will was focused on getting that fish. Finally, he jerked the rod so that the big fish flopped into the boat, and it landed on his lap. And in an instant, one hook was stuck firmly in the fish's jaw, and the other hook stuck just as firmly in Cliff's thigh. And the fish began to flop desperately. And every time it flopped, the blood spurted. And the wife, who had been so impressed with her husband's fishing, was now quite disgusted and grossed out by all of the blood splattering over her and everything else. Now for Pastor Clifford, this was a moment of conversion. For until that point in the story, he had desperately wanted to possess that bass. But when he was hooked himself, the very thing that he had sought to possess now possessed him. And what he wanted most was to get rid of it. Eventually, he painfully tore the fish loose and threw it back. And that, my friends, is how it is with wealth. Having wealth is fine, but wealth usually has us. What we set out to possess ends up possessing us. It is like a natural law. So our possessions, which are actually our possessors, hold us back from God. And that's why Jesus says in today's gospel that anyone who wants to be his disciple must let go of his possessions. Philemon's stuckness in wealth even made him keep a brother Christian in bondage. It does that sort of thing. Now, because we are located here on Washington Avenue, I have to tell you that the father of this country, George Washington, had a similar problem to Cliff and Philemon. After he retired from his job as President of the United States, George Washington wanted to emancipate his slaves. Partly, he wanted to set his slaves free because he was a decent fellow and he knew that was the right thing to do. But the truth is, mostly, he wanted to set his slaves free because the economics of agriculture had changed so that his slaves were now costing him more money than they were worth. So he wanted to set his slaves free. But his wife Martha and the rest of his family just would not hear it. They couldn't stand the thought of giving up their human property. So like Pastor Cliff, George was stuck. It kind of makes you wonder who possessed him. Just so you know the rest of the story, George Washington decided to free his slaves in his will so that his wife Martha could only complain about it to his coffin. Now, our attachment to our so-called possessions is a spiritual trap. The more we have, the more stuck we get. In American society, the richest Americans give away just over 2% of their income. Poor people give away just over 4% of their income. The poor are twice as generous as the rich because the grip of financial need is not as tight as the grip of financial There is an old lady who was just getting by. She had very, very little to live on, just scraping by. She was a very faithful member to her church. And so every Sunday she would go to her church and she would put $2 in the collection bin. And it made the pastor feel guilty. So the pastor stopped her one time and said, "Roberta, you don't need to do that. We're getting by okay. You need that money worse than we do." And I bet you know what she said. She said, "How dare you? How dare you try to stop me from participating in the gospel of Christ? How dare you deprive me of the right, my right, as a Christian, to give back to God a part of what God has given me?" Yes. The poor are freer than the rich. You know, this is a statistical fact. This is a statistical fact. Episcopalians in the United States do pretty well financially as a group. But it is true that if all of the Episcopalians quit their jobs and gave away their investments and went on welfare and tithed, the church's income would double. Fact. Now in this letter, Paul genuinely wants something good for Onesimus. His freedom. He wants something good for Christ, another missionary. But he also wants something good for Philemon. He likes Philemon. He respects Philemon. He knows Philemon is a good person. Paul knows that Philemon's problem isn't greed. It isn't anybody's problem. There isn't that much greed going around. His problem is fear. Fear that tomorrow he may not have enough. Fear is the glue that sticks us to our so-called possessions. Paul wants Philemon to know the peace and the freedom that comes from trusting God to do what God promised to do in today's song, to care for us, to sustain us. Paul wants Philemon to experience the faithfulness of God. Paul wants Philemon to know the peace that comes when faith triumphs over fear. Paul wants spiritual freedom for Philemon as much as he wants legal freedom for Onesimus. And in that freedom, Paul imagines that mutual freedom of Philemon and Onesimus, Paul imagines that Philemon and Onesimus might enjoy a new relationship. The relationship of brother to brother instead of master to slave. That's what's possible. Because, make no mistake, our attachment to wealth shapes, constrains, and impairs our relationships with people. So for Christ's sake, for Onesimus' sake, and for Philemon's sake, Paul makes the ask. He does not lay a moral duty on Philemon. He does not say, this is the law. He does not say, do this or you're a bad person. He simply appeals on the basis of love. Paul prays that Philemon will, quote, perceive all the good we may do for Christ. That Philemon may perceive all the good that Onesimus and I can do for Christ, if you ask. So, I wonder, what do you perceive that this church is doing for Christ? What might this church do for Christ? Now, as I ask that, I assume that Jesus has saved each of you from the pit just as he has saved me. And I don't just mean a bad fate after we die. Jesus has saved me with miracle and grace and inspiration, with hope and courage that were not my own, again and again and again. Every time my life has started to fall apart, Jesus has pulled it back together and put me back on the path. And I'm sure as I'm standing here that he has done the same for you, and just as sure he's going to do it again. So with that in mind, what do you suppose gladdens the heart of Jesus? Do you think he might care about the baptisms of children regardless of their ethnicities? Do the gifts that you send to Gibson Middle School matter to him? Does your music live his spirit? And when a lonely person is welcomed, visited, befriended, how does Jesus feel? What does this church do that gladdens the heart of Christ? What might it do? And if you perceive, if you see your gifts doing God's merciful will in this otherwise merciless world, might that set you free a little more from those things that possess you? Might the love of Jesus entice you to live a little more by faith and less by fear than you have thus far? And if you were in Philemon's shoes, if Paul wrote you a letter demanding a much larger gift than anyone has ever asked you for before, but it was to gladden the heart of Jesus through the ministry of this congregation, what might you do?